This is Fred Ricciani of TSC News. I've right here on the line via Skype one of our good friends of the show, WrestlingObserver.com's Victor Sosa. He is the co-host of Wrestling Weekly on WrestlingObserver.com with the legendary Les Thatcher. Unfortunately, we're not here to talk about WrestleMania. We're not here to talk about Roman Reigns, Daniel Bryan, none of that. We're here to talk about a terrible tragedy you've probably already heard about. Perro Aguayo Jr. passing away suddenly, seems to be in the ring Friday night. He was in the ring with Tigre Uno, Manic of TNA fame, and of course the legend Rey Mysterio. Seemed like a relatively simple spot except for the 619. And instead, it just resulted in his sudden death. A lot of comparisons being made to Misawa, a number of other deaths, Albright. I mean, just a terrible tragedy. If you haven't seen the video, we're going to talk about it. I just saw it actually a few minutes ago. My sister, who's not even a wrestling fan, and my friend Rola, who doesn't even watch wrestling, saw it before I did. I mean, that's how big this story's gotten. It's gotten not just coverage in Mexico, but all throughout the world, trending #1 on Twitter and Facebook. And Vic, I know you saw the match. You've probably seen the video from so many different angles. What do you think happened?
You know, it's really hard to say. It's very easy to speculate, and that's probably what the majority of our conversation is going to be, because that's pretty much what everybody's doing at this point. There's a number of different places in the match where, you know, when you're watching it with hindsight and you know what's going to happen, you know, you tend to watch it a little more critically, and perhaps you read into certain things a little bit more than you would otherwise. So there's a number of very well-educated people in the wrestling industry who have a number of differing opinions about where this whole thing may have started, if there was a particular moment in the match or something that perhaps preceded the obvious sight on the video where, unfortunately, Perro passes away. But I don't see any other way to describe this other than as an accident. And guys with significant in-ring experience, and I'm not one of them, I've never taken a bump in my life, but there have been several wrestlers, including Brian Alvarez, of course, who spent years in the ring, who is one of our leaders at F4WOnline.com, who said it really appeared to him as nothing more than an accident, and that's exactly the way I saw it, a completely freak kind of thing when you're considering the spots that you've seen Rey Mysterio and various opponents do probably thousands of times over the last 20 years.
And for those that didn't see the video, maybe for whatever reason they're just hearing about this now, can you just describe what exactly happened, just kind of the setting, what the match was all about, and kind of what transpired afterwards?
Well, it was Rey Mysterio and Tigre Uno, as you mentioned, against Manic and Perro Aguayo Jr. And basically, it broke down into a double 619 spot where Manic and Perro were supposed to be up against the ropes for the 619, but it was relatively early in the match, so they were both supposed to get out of the way. What preceded that, however, is, I don't want to call it they used to call it junction, as the legendary Ed Whalen of Stampede Wrestling used to call it. But signals were kind of crossed there in the ring a little bit, in that instead of getting into 619 position from a Hurricane Rana that Rey delivered to Perro bumped outside the ring. As I heard Brian Alvarez and Dave Meltzer on Wrestling Observer discuss a little while ago, it was Brian's opinion that Perro was a little too close to the ropes to safely execute the spot, so he sort of audibilized and took the bump outside the ring. Now, I've watched this, as you mentioned, from a number of different angles. I've seen it at least from 3 different angles. I thought, and I know some other people feel the same way, but I don't know, that when he took outside the ring, he may have hit the back of his head or the base of his neck against the ring apron before going out to the floor. And he landed on his feet. He went from his feet to his knees, back up and back into the ring. You may remember the injury that Shawn Michaels suffered, the debilitating back injury that necessitated him leaving WWE for almost 4 years. Looked like a pretty innocuous bump, just caught his back on the edge of something and continued the match. And unfortunately, not long after that, he needed surgery and was gone for an extended period of time. So I thought, and still part of me does think, that maybe he caught his neck or the back of his head on the edge of the ring apron, which is the hardest part of the ring. And maybe that's where it started. If you see the video or get a chance to see it, or perhaps are not interested, and I would certainly understand if you're not, he takes the bump out to the floor from the Hurricane Rana, pops to his feet immediately because he knows that's not where he's supposed to be. But from the moment he gets up, and rolls back into the ring, he starts moving, kind of like in slow motion. He rolls in very gingerly back into the ring on one knee, looking at Ray because he knows the 619 spot is supposed to be coming. Ray throws a drop kick. Perro clearly puts his hand up or his arm up to protect himself on the drop kick. So he's definitely coherent enough to know what's going on here. But he takes the drop kick and rolls into the 619 position. And according to the doctors, this is where the doctors believe the cervical trauma took place that ended his life. When he took the kick, went into the ropes. It was either that moment when he went into the ropes or a second moment where Manik was then put into the 619 position, a drop toe hold from Tigre Uno. And of course, Manik has to be in position right next to Perro. But Manik, in doing so, perhaps we think maybe the force of the rope movement when Manik then hits the ropes perhaps may have been that moment as well. That's what the doctors are speculating. They said it was whiplash from the ropes. And those are the only two things where it could have been if the doctors are in fact correct, and they are the medical professionals here.
So the exact cause of death is, I mean, would you say, I guess,
cervical spine trauma, I believe, was the phrase they used.
Man, that's just that's just rough. And the thing I hate really, like what I've seen the last, I don't know, few hours, just the clickbait. Yes, it's significant that he was in the ring with one of the biggest superstars of all time, but don't try to act like, oh, he died because of Rey Mysterio. I mean, this is such a freak accident. I don't want to say it was a fluke, but you could kind of call it that. I mean, these are trained professionals. Perro Aguayo has been wrestling for 20 years, comes from wrestling royalty, and it just happened like out of the blue. I mean, it could have happened to anybody. And the crazy thing too, I mean, you want to talk about the awful week that Triple A's had, right? They were supposed to have the Ray to Ray show, gets delayed due to rain. The next day, it was scheduled. It got delayed because of some issue with permits or whatever. Then a couple of days later, there was a bus accident where their coordinator tragically passed away, and I think like 30 other people got injured. And then my God. And now, of course, this is getting worldwide coverage. Obviously, one of the biggest stars in their promotion, in all of wrestling, Lucha Libre. And just to see it exploited like this, I mean, it's very reminiscent to me of kind of like how they exploited Owen Hart and Benoit and all that stuff like that, and they're trying to find different angles. I mean, look, it was a freak accident, okay? It happened. It's tragic, but you really, you know what I mean? I didn't see Manik or Tigre or Ray be any reckless in that match. To pretty much do the same spots they always do.
Yeah, to me it was very, and I don't say this in a demeaning or disrespectful way, a formula match. The spots where this injury and apparently Perro passed away are spots that you've seen. If you've ever seen a Rey Mysterio match, you saw what happened in this match without ever having to watch it. It's something that Ray typically does. There was nothing out of the ordinary, I thought, or any unnecessary chances taken by any of the four guys in the match that led up to that. So, there was nothing out of the ordinary from what they normally do. I'll put it that way, because everything is an extreme risk when you're a wrestler for a living. And I think something like this, where it seems innocuous and is a completely freak accident, at least in my opinion, it was a freak accident. I know you share that as well, Fred, it just underscores how difficult and how dangerous this profession really is. I think sometimes we take that for granted because, we see these guys day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out, year in and year out, taking these falls, doing these stunts, for lack of a better term, and they keep on keeping on. And very rarely do we actually hear about the injuries and the pain and the amount of work that it takes to find the courage, frankly, to climb into that ring every single night, knowing that your life is on the line and you are putting your life literally in the hands of your opponent. And sometimes it doesn't matter how safe you are, how good you are, how good the man you're staring at across the ring is, things are going to happen. And I think, at least in my opinion, that's really what happened here in Tijuana, Mexico last night. Things happened, and it didn't matter how great or how legendary the family Perro Aguayo comes from. how much of a veteran he is and how much he knows how to take care of himself in that ring, as he did so expertly for 20 plus years, or how great Rey Mysterio is at taking care of his opponents as he has for 20 plus years. Sometimes things happen that are just, you can't foresee them, and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
Well said, my friend. Well, before we let you go, obviously this is a tragedy. Would you be able to just, I'm not asking you to do a whole career retrospective because that would take hours, and Perro Aguayo's had a legendary career, but can you give us kind of like the Cliff Notes version of why this guy was just so significant in Mexico?
Top heel in the AAA promotion. So he was one of the very top guys in the company at this particular point in time. A very important guy who was going to be slotted into the biggest spots and the biggest matches in the AAA promotion this year. It was no secret that they were building towards a hair versus mask match between Perro Aguayo and Mystices, the former Mystico and also the original Sin Cara in WWE, and also a title program eventually at some point with Alberto El Patron, the former Alberto Del Rio. And prior to that, basically, Perro Aguayo Jr. had been a star from day one. As you mentioned earlier, Fred, debuted at the age of 16 in Mexico and been wrestling ever since. And he was a top guy based on the fact that he does, in fact, come from wrestling royalty, as you also mentioned. Perro Aguayo Sr. was a legendary competitor in Mexico and Japan for well over 30 years, one of the biggest stars in the history of Lucha Libre. So Perro Jr. got into the business and was a star on night one because he was his father's son. But over the course of the 20-year career that he had, he remained a top star and one of the biggest names in Mexican wrestling on merit. The kid earned it over time. He was handed a top spot, but in order to keep it, he had to evolve, he had to grow, he had to change, he had to maintain that spot. And he did that on merit, on talent, on charisma, on his promos. The guy was a total package. And he was part of the big renaissance for CMLL, which is AAA's rival promotion in Mexico. In fact, CMLL is, I believe, the longest running promotion in the history of professional wrestling. They're over 80 years now in business. And a few years ago, their big run when Mexican wrestling was very hot, 7, 8 years or so ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. It was a nice long period they had, and it may have started as long as maybe 10 years ago, actually, was with Mystico on top, Mystices now in AAA, against Perro Aguayo Jr. And that was the really hot period for CMLL in the early part of the 2000s, where Perro formed Los Perros del Mal. Basically, your Four Horsemen, your Evolution, your, fill in your faction there. That was the hottest faction in wrestling. Your DX, the gimmicks, the shirts, the charisma. I mean, they were the hottest thing in wrestling. They were the guys like the NWO. They were the bad guys, and everybody loved them anyway because they were just so good and so super charismatic. And that is really where he took his stardom and his name to that other level where he was a superstar of the highest order on merit. And he earned his spot. So Perro Aguayo Jr. was a guy who absolutely, especially in Mexico, transcended Lucha Libre. There isn't somebody in Mexico who doesn't know who Perro Aguayo Jr. is. And so the guy is an enormous star, will obviously continue to be, unfortunately, after his passing. Obviously not unfortunate he's going to be a star, but unfortunate that his name is now going to grow so quickly because he passed away way too young. 36 is, that's way too young in anybody's book.
Totally agree. And as we spoke off the air, I mean, it seems like he's a guy that was certainly cementing his case for perhaps one day being in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame and being enshrined amongst the many of the greats.
I think he was a worthy candidate yesterday. Whether or not he gets in the near future, I'm not sure because the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame rules, you're not even taken as a candidate or allowed to be considered for the Hall of Fame until you're 35, of which he is this year. So usually the voters kind of frowned upon folks in their first couple of years of eligibility, specifically when they have just turned the age of 35. So I don't know if he wouldn't have gotten in the next couple of years, but he is a worthy candidate for discussion long before this happened. And I suspect he'll get in sooner rather than later.
Well said, Vic. Well, Vic, I really want to thank you so much for your time, man. For those that want to follow you on Twitter, you, of course, can visit at VS1067. That's at VS1067. You can also check out his hit show, Wrestling Weekly, with the legendary Wes Thatcher, every week on WrestlingObserver.com, F4WOnline.com. Anywhere else, Vic?
No, I think that pretty much covers it, brother. I appreciate the time, and as you mentioned, I'm sorry we were getting together under these circumstances, but hopefully we get a chance to talk under happier circumstances soon.
Absolutely. Take care, my friend. Thanks so much for your time. Folks, I hope you enjoyed Victor Sosa there, sharing some memories of Perro Aguayo Jr., just a terrible tragedy. Apologize for a little bit of the lighting setup. We kind of did this on the fly. I'm outside of my studio, but we figured with this getting such worldwide coverage, right now, we couldn't wait. And Vic's a guy that's been following Lucha Libre for years, is one of the personalities of, in my opinion, one of the best wrestling sites out there in WrestlingObserver.com. So I want to thank him for the time. I want to thank all of you for watching. What else is there to say other than rest in peace, Perro Aguayo Jr.?